Good morning, Bahamas. This is the Eye Opener, your weekly dose of something different. I am your host with maybe the most, Alea, and I am out of studio today, coming from you very much live and direct from London, which is still, as always, y'all, very dark, very gloomy, very rainy, and very cloudy. I can't wait to get some sunshine, some fresh air, and some sunshine and see when I come home soon. Oh, y'all, it's rough over here. But I am alone in studio today with Brittany as our producer. Hey, Britt. We got Don, Tate, and Crystal out of office today. So, y'all, it's just you, me, the open road, and these headlines. But you know what? I'm hoping that at the end of this, we will feel a bit more relaxed, a bit ready to tackle the week, and maybe even a bit more enlightened, which is what I plan to do with breaking down some of these headlines this week. So let's get into it. We have a lot, both locally and internationally, y'all, but let's start with something positive. So 100 Abaco residents received life-changing cataract surgeries. The World Cataract Foundation and Liquid Legacy partnered with the Ministry of Health and Wellness this week, with each procedure estimated at $15,000, and it was carried out at the Marsh Harbor Healthcare Center. The police tribunal has yet to provide a verdict on the alleged bribery attempt between a tourist and an incident whereby officers actually prevented another tourist from using the bathroom, causing her to defecate on the floor. At the end of February, the government signed a 15-year renewable lease agreement with D&T Shipping to redevelop a building at Potter's Cay Dock into a Family Island freight and passenger terminal. The Davis administration and the Grand Bahama Port Authority are calling victory for different reasons, mind you, following the long-awaited decision in the government's 2-year arbitration claim against Freeport's quasi-governmental authority. And on Wednesday, FNM leader Michael Pintard told journalists that he plans to confirm from Long Island MP Adrian Gibson if he plans to run as an independent candidate in the upcoming election. And speaking of FNM, the party accused the Parliamentary Registration Department of bias and partisan conduct after a voter registration drive, was held at ILTV Studios in late February. Finally, after CARICOM pledged to support Cuba in light of the ongoing U.S.-caused humanitarian crisis, the Prime Minister also confirmed that the Bahamas will assist in Cuba's support on Thursday. Now, world news, we all know things going on. So on February 27th, the Prime Minister of St. Kitts and Nevis, Dr. Terence Drew, he indicated CARICOM's intention to provide humanitarian support to Cuba in light of the crisis in the Spanish-speaking country. Bahamians in or traveling to Cuba say that life on the island has actually become extremely difficult after the U.S. cut off all Venezuelan oil shipments, triggering blackouts, transport disruptions, and rising tensions among residents. Jamaica also ended the 50-year-old medical program with Cuba, and the U.S. and Venezuela have decided to resume diplomatic ties. Finally, the cat's out of the bag, y'all. I think most of us already know, or maybe have an opinion, whether that be a little one, or in this case, mine. Y'all know I tend to have strong opinions, a really, maybe a visceral or vehement one, about this Iran-U.S.-Israel war. But I want to also tackle what's going on. I find that a lot of times we tend to talk about these issues, but we don't break it down for people who are listening and just kind of getting into the swing of learning and digesting an issue. And we kind of tend to jump in the middle of it. But I really want to start at the beginning because it's a long time coming. It's something that I really think is like a real domino effect. And it also has, I guess, ties to, the genocide in Palestine as well. And what it means, how it's occurring, and whose side we should really be on as maybe members of the Global South, but also members of the West Indies. But let's get into all of that in a bit. Let's start locally first. So, this police tribunal, they have yet to actually provide a verdict on the bribery attempt and the incident where the officers actually prevented this lady from using the bathroom. There was a viral video about, I think a little while back, where this lady had her underwear around her ankles. It was a awful video. And you could hear the officers in the background laughing and kind of taunting her. So months after the officers were actually arraigned before the RBPF tribunal, the Commissioner of Police, Shanta Knowles, told journalists that both matters are still pending. So she said that the hearing dates have apparently been set, but there has been no final determination. Which honestly begs the question, when exactly do these people meet? Y'all, I could be real with you. Knowing the public service, as a gal from the public service myself, right? Proud public service worker. People love to get paid for just being on a committee. But, hello, is there any work being done? Are y'all being paid without actually doing any of the work? This feels like a normal day-to-day thing right now. I'm kind of confused. And a lot of us talk about the inaction by our authorities. Or when there is action, it seems like the wrong kind of action. And I'll say it before, and we've said it before a couple times on the show, and I'll say it again. The RBPF and the RBDF, as with most armed forces, most militaristic organizations, they are what we consider boys' clubs, right? And then if we could go by the stats, because I wanted to check and really get to the nitty gritty of it, because I was like, okay, look, this is 2 incidents of however many. So I say, let me just do a quick Google search-a-rooney and see what I could find. So in the latter half of 2025, Commissioner Knowles actually noted that non-lethal weapons in the officer arsenal is necessary given the amount of coroner court jury rulings, y'all, against police officers in fatal shooting cases. So that's number 1. That was in August, right? So we got August. In November, 3 officers were then under investigation in connection with the escape of an accused murderer from the magistrate court complex on South Street. That's November. And in December, she then rejected public accusation of impropriety and corruption in the investigation of Lashiko Pratt, who died in public, saying that the officers, and I quote, y'all, have nothing to hide, right? He was in custody, and he passed away. And then, so that was last year. Now let's come to this year. The year just started, man, and things already licking off. In January, the Tribune actually reported that there were only 4 police convictions, despite 169 civilian complaints being lodged against officers last year. So that's 102 cases that were closed. And they were closed with no further action. And then the 13 were considered unfounded, without sufficient evidence, or they were just withdrawn. That is not promising. That gives me no confidence in what y'all got going on. And I love me a little armed forces. I love the guys and gals on our force who protect and serve. But we have to do better, and we really do, as a society and as citizens, as the laymen. We have to hold people in these positions of authority and in these organizations and the organizations themselves accountable. Last week, we talked a little bit about, quote unquote, draining the swamp, right? Draining the mangroves with Tate. And I feel like this is a really good example, because right now we got this tribunal court, and they have yet to provide a verdict on something that was ages ago. And it's like, what else y'all got to do? This is your one job. You should be doing more. You should be trying to beat the record. Every time y'all step on the floor, every time y'all meet, y'all should be trying to lock in and make sure y'all get everything sorted. I just wish there was a bit more pride in our work, but maybe also a bit more shame. Maybe that's what it is. People ain't shame no more. You call people out sometimes, and you call organizations out, and they'll still continue doing the mess they doing. But y'all, still we rise, eh? Let's move from us and go to Freeport. Now, this is something that's been a long time coming. I think a lot of us have had quite a few opinions on the Grand Bahama Port Authority, what they've been doing, right? How they work. And by extension, the Hawksbill Creek Agreement, right? So both groups, the government and the Port Authority, they said they got some wins this week for the arbitration and in the arbitration claim against the authority. Now, the government suffered a setback when the actual panel told both parties to renegotiate the annual figure, right, that the GBPA should pay. So the original total is, the government put forth the figure of 357 million, right? But the tribunal, however, did rule against the Port Authority in 7 of its 8 counterclaims. And to this, our Attorney General was like, you know what? This actually could result, so the dispute itself could result in the dismissal of the Supreme Court challenges to IRCA's authority to supervise the utilities in Freeport. And then on Wednesday this week, the Prime Minister actually pledged to break the order. Specifically, he said, we cannot live with an arrangement in which 2 families decide the fate of tens of thousands of Bahamians in Freeport in our own country without clear rules and proper accountability. That's a direct quote. I'm going to have to agree with him. I don't know about y'all, but look, y'all know I'm big on socialism. I'm a huge leftist, and I completely agree. I always say that our national resources, our assets should always be in the hands of the government them. Now, I agree there, but the opposition had some things to say, specifically Michael Pintard and East GB MP Kwasi Thompson on Wednesday. They said during the parliamentary session that they supported the Port Authority's stance in the tribunal. They actually agreed with them. They said that they support them having sole authority to administer licensing, immigration, customs, land purchases, and other approvals, including utilities. So, let's just go directly from the paper, though. Because from there, we also had, if you took a look and you saw on social media was a bit ablaze this week, with the actual co-chairman, writing an open letter to the Prime Minister. Now, before we get into that, because I have some thoughts about that. I do feel like it is a bit of a detraction from what we're actually talking about. That letter being penned and put out. So, I think this is the long and short of it for me. The government has every right to assert its authority over the GBPA. Now, maybe that's the socialist in me, but every single inch of property in our archipelago should belong to the government. Now, that's not saying that you shouldn't own your property now, but if you are misusing it, look, if there's an illegal activity, or in the case of the Port Authority, you have had unfettered control over an entire city, you gotta still be under the purview of the government, damn. That's just how things should be. This ain't no lawless pirate town. We ain't in the wild, wild west. Now, brave is no Lyndon Pinling by any means, but our first Prime Minister criticized the law as well that left the city under private control. Many of the same criticisms he had back then still remain with us now, and mine really is simple. The Hawksbill Creek Agreement was signed in 1955. That is how many years before we got independence again? And then the Port Authority, right, which is jointly owned by the St. George and Hayward families, that has served as the municipal authority in Freeport. Y'all, there's no way on God's green earth that two families should have so much power and authority over the second largest city or any city of this country. And for some reason, the co-chairman of the Port Authority actually defended his Bahamian identity. I don't know how you go through all this arbitration and all this stuff with court, and you hear the Prime Minister's words, right, about the actual order, whereby he talks about, the fact that he wants to replace the order, the current thing, the status quo with one, this is a quote, in which Bahamian sovereignty is real in Freeport, in which self-determination is a lived reality for the people who call that island home. I think that's a beautiful sentiment to have. I'ma just be real. But it's not about you. And I don't mean the PM when I say that. I mean the co-chairman. Because he then decided to pen this open letter, right? And he was a bit, I don't want to say it gave me vibes, but it was basically a response to Prime Minister Davis saying that under the administration, the Port Authority will remain in Freeport, but under a new status quo and undeclared rules. That's also a quote. New status quo, undeclared rules, right? He just vowed like the government was determined to exert the full authority over Freeport in the wake of the arbitration tribunal, right? And y'all, I don't know what, I read the letter and I saw I felt like, and I still feel this way, that people got caught up, or people are getting caught up in the identity politic of it. That is a very, very popular thing right now, right? Where we look at the identity of someone and we say, oh yes, most definitely they're qualified. Or we look at their identity and that can automatically explain away bad actions. That don't do it for me. That don't do it for me. I'm sorry. Maybe that's the Gen Z in me, you know. I've lived through many, many phases of wokery and wokeness, right? And I myself, I'm very, very woke. I'm very far left. But identity politics, you got to put that aside. It's the culture war. And the culture war, as we know it, is always an excuse to prevent us from actually scrutinizing things, from taking a closer look at stuff and criticizing them, rightfully so. Now, in this letter, he actually said that his daughter burst into tears. Those were his exact words, y'all. She burst into tears when she understood how their family had been characterized. Now, this is a quote from him. He says, she simply could not understand how someone who is meant to represent all Bahamians, not only those of a particular political persuasion, could say such things about a Bahamian family that has devoted so much of its life to this country and to the people of Grand Bahama. He says his father was born in the Bahamas before independence and became a citizen when the country gained independence in 1973. I don't know about y'all. That kind of threw me for a loop. Because I said to my mommy, I read that and I say, I could be real, like, you ain't special. Somebody got to tell Mr. Hayward, you ain't special, bro. My Grammy was also born in the Bahamas before independence and became a citizen of the country when we gained independence. So many of our Grammys and Grampies were also born before independence. What you cooking right now? You ain't cooking nothing good. Whatever you cooking, at the very least, I ain't eating it up. I ain't ordering it. But look, being criticized for hoarding resources and not actually benefiting the lives of Bahamians you claim to also protect and support and love, that's not us saying you're not Bahamian. But it definitely does call your national pride into question. And I'm honestly resentful of the fact that you bring up your identity. When we criticize and complain about some of the other big entrepreneurs who are fully Bahamian, their identity is not called into question. They are still very much Bahamian. As are you. You're still very much Bahamian, but being Bahamian does not absolve you of your sins. That's not the end all be all. Very much so. There have been so many people from so many different countries who betray the interests of their own people. And you bringing up the fact that you're Bahamian is honestly a bit of a slap in the face. Because, brother, so are they. The people you claiming to protect and love, I'm not seeing it because the actions ain't adding up. It's just not doing it for me. And I wish Tate was here to really tackle this, because Tate is our resident Freeport person in chief. But I'm sure we'll end up bringing this more to the forefront anyway with the discussions when he's back in studio with us, because honestly, this ain't going nowhere. We've had so many chats about the Hawksbill Creek Agreement, so many chats about the Port Authority and the way they lowered their authority, the way they really wield that authority in Freeport and what that has meant for the stagnation of Freeport and the treatment of people in Freeport, the immigration. Like, there's no way. The more I learn about it, because I don't know about y'all, but me as a Nasuvian, right, a Nassau gal, I have always been, it always felt like the details of the GBPA has felt a bit murky. I've always been a bit confused as to what that meant and what what it was all about and how the lives of Freeport were really affected. But this arbitration debacle has kind of opened my eyes quite a bit, hearing that they are responsible for immigration, which I genuinely believe, once again, nobody should be in charge of other than the government. That's that on that. But hopefully we get to tackle this and really delve into it. I really want to go into what it is, what the agreement is, how that has affected the lives of people in Freeport from then to now, and really kind of get like a timeline of it, because I think everything goes so much deeper than we think. And when we talk about this shipping company at the port in Nassau, I did some research on that, which we're going to get into in a bit, and it really does go deep. Things really do intersect. And I think that is something that as time progresses, like as we get more and more deeper and deeper into late stage capitalism, we're realizing, hold on, everything connected. So let's go back to the start of this arbitration, right? Something I wanted to talk about week before last was about the government actually wanting to acquire GBPC. And then also the government is using compulsory acquisition to obtain the International Bazaar in Freeport in Grand Bahama. So let me give you all a rundown, right? For people who don't know, the government published a note of compulsory acquisition in the newspaper a week or two ago. So originally, the $50 million Afro-Caribbean Marketplace and Logistics Center, it was expected to be a retail center and a logistics hub for authentic Caribbean African goods with the African Export-Import Bank. It was they had already allocated the funds to the government for the development of it. But the progress was actually left in the hands of, you guessed it, the Grand Bahama Port Authority. Once again, back again at the scene of the crime. Government intervention is necessary to protect public interests. I repeat, government intervention is necessary to protect our interests, y'all. Like, I find it a bit funny that the Chamber's central claim is that the acquisition will discourage private interest. I mean, it'll discourage private interest and investment, right? The idea that private capital is the most effective and responsible engine for development, that is simply not true when the International Bazaar has been in decline for decades. For a hot minute, like, what are we doing here? I once again feel like I have to reiterate this. We talked about this again, last week, right? The idea that public-private partnerships, I'm not going to say they're not useful, but I am, once again, a socialist. I'm very big on our assets being in our own hands. That means whatever is in our public interest, whatever is in our best interest, right? That is our priority first and foremost. Everything else should be secondary. And the moment you start to put stuff in the hands of private owners, that is all lost. It's moot because they don't care about your interests anymore. They don't care about your safety. They don't care about your health. They don't care about your well-being. They don't care about what you gain. It's all about the funds they could make. They all care about shareholder value, maximizing shareholder output. And that is what we need to remember when we think about, do we want private investment? When we think about, do we want this industry to be even worse than it was? Sometimes you find that when you privatize an industry, like in the US, they've privatized their healthcare, right? We have a United States where, just look at them, the sight of them. People are hoarding and, I guess, what is it called? They're like micromanaging their insulin so that they don't die. There are people in the US who refuse to call an ambulance in a medical emergency because they are afraid of the amount of money it costs. That is what happens when you privatize your own industry. That's what happens. And I just don't want that to happen to us in any way, shape, or form. Now, we're not talking about healthcare, right? We are talking about the International Bazaar. Sure. But how much is it going to take? Like, how long is it going to take for that sentiment to bleed over into the other stuff? I veto it. That's a big veto, a big no-no for me, right? So the reports, getting into the meat of it, the reports describe fragmented ownership. Now, I didn't notice, but the International Bazaar has actually had numerous individual parcel holders, and that's the thing that's actually made the coordinated redevelopment difficult. So private owners, once again, you put your interest in the hands of a few, so the many do not benefit. So the private owners of this, right, they're unable to, or they are unwilling to restore or develop the property in a way that actually serves the community. And there it is. So it's inconsistent to constantly argue that the state should continue waiting for private investors when decades of private ownership produced neglect. If private actors didn't mobilize the capital when the actual land value of the International Bazaar was low, and when these opportunities actually existed, then it's just so unrealistic to assume that they suddenly will just be like, you know what? You're right. We were a fool. Let's get off our butts and get to work, folks. They're not going to think that. That's not what they're going to do. They're not. We're in fantasy land if we think they're going to just wake up one day and suddenly realize, wait a minute, I'm actually not contributing to my country. I'm making things worse. They're not going to do that unless the government says, hey, we have a couple of dollars wrapped up in this shirt. Here's what it is, turkey. Here's your Christmas turkey. Here's your $50 in the turkey. Give us a little something. So they need a public subsidiary, or they need a public guarantee for funding. And again, when you put these resources, when you put things in the hands of a few, not only are they looking at what's in it for me and what's not in it for you, they want you to pay for it. So they don't even be paying. That's the worst part that really grinds my gears. You mean to tell me we giving you this vibe and you wouldn't even go pay for it? Well, Jesus, what I give you this for? I thought you was going to do a little something with the money. And in April of 2025, the Minister for Grand Bahama, Ginger Moxie, actually gave an update on the progress, right? So, again, this Afro-Caribbean marketplace, which I think is honestly quite cool. I think it gives us, we love a little diasporic communication, a little diasporic cultural exchange vibe, right? Cool. I just want something to be done with it. At least they're trying something. So I got to give, credit where credit is due, right? But this was in April 2025, y'all. It's 2026. March. We about to reach April in a couple of weeks and still nothing, right? So she had said that the progress was being made. So they've been new. They've been new what was going on. So the acquisition has essentially been really tedious, right? The bazaar, the International Bazaar has 13 owners. 13. That's a lot of hands for the money to pass through. That's a lot of slices of pie and of cake, right? And that's a lot of different public interests. Everyone's interest as well is so different sometimes. It's hard to get people to agree. And if they're not in agreement, they're unwilling or they just don't want to. So she had said, this is also a quote from her, she said that the issue with the bazaars, in terms of it having 13 owners, we've already got an agreement to acquire the land itself. And that's what we're finalizing now in terms of payment for the land. So it was budgeted for, and they're looking to complete that within the next few weeks or so. That was in April of 2025. Ain't looking too solid, if I do say so myself. Ain't looking too good. Ain't looking too good. But let's keep the faith alive, eh? Let's hold the faith, and let's check in on that in a few weeks, right? Let's check in, maybe in April. Because then it's a year. Let's see if there's anything being done there. But I will say that seems to also intersect with the arbitration in court. So there's just a lot going on, but it feels as though it's a bit of a race against time with the upcoming election to sort Freeport out, right? There was a lot of promises given to the people of Freeport, and you always got to be ready to put your money where your mouth is as a government. You cannot race against time at the last second to do something for a people that you promised something toward ages ago. And that's just that, right? And again, y'all, wish Tate was here. Tate, we missing you. We love you. And I'm sure when we check back in on this and we have Tate in studio, I'm sure he'll be able to provide a bit of a more personal lens as to what, how people in Freeport feel. I think that's also something to consider, that when we talk about the Out Islands and Freeport and just the resources or lack thereof, like, we cannot keep centering the people from Nassau. Like me speaking on this is all well and good and dandy, but it is important to constantly be able to hear the voices from the people that actually live and work there, right? And that call these places home. Like, it's not fair for us to run our mouth all the time. We in Nassau, and it is a privilege to be here in the capital, you know what I mean? Vibing and vibing and chilling and grilling and have all these resources that are allocated to us as people in the capital of the country. So let's keep our fingers crossed on that, man. But oh gosh, it's frustrating, isn't it? Now let's get into a little bit of would I call this an election update? I guess we could call it that. The FNM accused the Parliamentary Registration Department a week or two ago of bias. I really wanted to tackle this, but we had so much going on last week that I couldn't get us to talk about it. But y'all, it reached. So they accused the PRD of bias and partisan conduct after a voter registration drive was held at Island Luck TV studios. Let that sink in. This is a public service. This is voter registration for our election. Why is it being held at a private business? What are you doing? So Verizon Media Group CEO Gershon Major, not yesterday, but last week, right? In February, actually, February 20th to be precise, he denied the claims that a voter registration drive was held, that when it was held, it was actually connected to any political party or candidate. Y'all, do you think I'm stupid? Do you think they think we stupid? Like, we gotta be serious, man. You mean to tell... So at Island Luck TV Studios. Hold on, rewind. At Island Luck TV Studios was not connected to any political party or candidate? Okay. And you know what? I am not Alea. I am a short Indian man named Gurpreet. That's the fact. Since we making things up, let's just call it that then. So the Progressive Liberal Party Fort Charlotte candidate, Sabas, right, is the chairman of Verizon Media Group. Hello, is this thing on? He was actually, so Major was responding to the concerns raised by journalists. And journalists had actually mentioned this, but so had Travis Robinson, y'all, the candidate for Fort Charlotte. So he actually brought up that registration drives should be only at civic spaces, not those connected to political candidates. And that is a very valid point. I don't think we should be having these kinds of activities and stuff at places like Island Luck TV Studios. I feel like I've said Island Luck TV Studios so much, but really, like, what are we doing here? Sometimes I feel like we live in the Twilight Zone, because you you can't keep pulling out the wool over our eyes and telling me this is my these are my spectacles. You cannot keep doing that. Like, I know what's going on. You know what's going on. We know what's going on. Hello. So Major was actually responding to those concerns. And he said, and I quote, Verizon Media Group remains firmly committed to neutrality, to fairness, and through Eyewitness News platform, the highest standard of journalistic integrity. Once again, you're pulling the wool over my eyes, bro. Stop. So what's killing me about this whole thing is that it feels like people think we are stupid. And this is my genuine question. Do you really believe that you are the first set of millionaires to own a news station or a newspaper or a media company? Like, we know that it's used to manipulate the press and control the flow of information. This isn't new, okay? That you're not creating a novel strategy here. You didn't just break the mold, man. You just fit into it the way you were expected to. That's how this works when you're a literal millionaire or billionaire or a member of the bourgeoisie and you own a media company. Like, you know what? Let's not even look here. Ask Michael Bloomberg. He tried to run for office as well. Let's see how that worked out. Child, anyways, I am a big proponent of transparency. I think that as a person or an entrepreneur in this case, as you climb up that ladder, right, that entrepreneurial ladder, and you obtain more and more success, I believe that you should always try to be more and more transparent. I think to the point where you even oversharing, because the criticism of you is fair. Like, I do believe that at a certain point when it comes to, especially with wealth, right? Like, you are hoarding resources. And to go ahead after all of that and turn around and own a news company, right? A news station, a newspaper, a media company, whatever, and say that that is the height of journalistic integrity, it's simply untrue. It's simply untrue. I'm sorry. But they're not going to put out a hit piece on you. They're not going to divulge, and delve deep into your praxis and your politic because you own them. It would be in their worst interest to do so. The journalist that tries to will be fired or penalized or targeted. That's just how that works. So, in other news, the government has actually entered a 15-year renewable lease agreement with D&T Shipping. This is to redevelop a building at Potter's Key Dock into a Family Island freight and passenger terminal. Now, I also have some real thoughts about this. This happened the same week that this ILTV Studios thing was really brought to the forefront of, the news. So the details about it, for people who aren't familiar with what's going on over there, is the contract was awarded. The circumstances of that, it's unclear. So if that sentence didn't make any sense, good. It seems like that is also kind of the point. What we do know is that the deal involves the former Bahamas Agricultural Industrial Corporation building. This is once known as the Produce Exchange, for people who may be familiar with that title for the building. The government actually retains ownership of the property, right? But, big but here, D&T Shipping finances the refurbishment at a reported cost of $6.5 million. Now, I believe that we should always scrutinize things. We always got to delve deeper into stuff. We got to really question the integrity of these contracts, of the people obtaining the contract, and what their connections might be to the government, right? To anyone in government, or what kind of work they've had before. That latter part, the latter is so crucial. So I was like, you know what? Let me give them the benefit of the doubt, but let me just check and see who these people is. So D&T Shipping, what is it? So Gregory Stewart is the president and chief executive of D&T Group of Companies, right? This is kind of like a conglomerate, Bahamian company. So let's check that. Take that off the docket, right? So they said the redevelopment revives the historic produce exchange model. And for people who aren't aware, like myself, right, this was a model where farmers in the Family Islands who brought goods to Nassau, they could sell it. I absolutely love it. We talk about this all the time, right? Not just on the show, but the idea that we need to have some real cooperation between our islands. And that, back in the day, our farmers used to be providing us with goods and services and vice versa. And there was a real flow of commerce. So I love it. I love this idea in theory. He said that the project aims to replace the current practice, right? So the current practice is passengers will wait outdoors or in vehicles before actually, going on the vessel, like going on the boat. And it'll have an air-conditioned terminal for seating and refreshments because it's hot, which I also like. I like the idea of that. And that the building itself, the new refurbished building, will house maritime logistics operations, including a marine supply store for mailboats, for fishing vessels, for freight operators, and a space for the sale of Bahamian-grown produce. So there's a lot going on, right? There's this maritime vibe, but also like this real flow of commerce vibe, but also like this idea of just cooperation. I love it in theory. Now, construction began in August of 2025, and it is actually expected to finish in late April or early in the second quarter of this year. So it's that, and it's reaching, and I love that. However, I said a few minutes ago, we got to look into things. Who are these companies? Who are the people running them? What's the connection between them and the government? What's their work, right? We always have to look at what's the work. Even if we completely ignore whatever, connections they may have, who their personal relationships are, we have to look at what they were doing before they received this contract. So I say, let me do a little type in the Googles and see what's going on and see what this company is. D&T Shipping is embroiled in a 30,000 gallon Exuma oil spill from 2022. Let that sink in. Let me repeat it actually. Rewind. The company that is responsible for this maritime project, they just talked about it having, the building having a marine supply store for the mailboat, for freight operators, and also, they were talking about this idea of this produce exchange model, right? They are embroiled in a court battle at the moment, in a scandal, an oil spill scandal in Exuma. Y'all know them waters gorgeous. In Exuma from 2022. So the actual thing goes like this. D&T Shipping has a vessel called an MT Arabian, right? The vessel was transporting fuel supplied by BISX listed Focal Holdings, right, to Bahamas Power and Light, so BPL, the generation facilities on the island, so on Exuma, when the spill occurred. This was revealed in a November 5th, 2025 ruling by Sir Ian Winder. Now, this scandal, which is it, and the scandal it is, because 30,000 gallons, that's a lot of oil, y'all. That is a lot of oil. They launched a Supreme Court action against the U.S. supplier and Indian manufacturer because they said that it was actually defective hose that caused the pollution. So not actually them. It wasn't me. It was the hose that we bought from India that actually do it and da-da-da-da-da. It's still your fault, brother. It's still your fault. So Dexter Adderley, which is Focal Sun Oil's president and chief executive, said that the spill, these are his words, so, and I quote, the spill actually resulted from a ruptured hose during the discharge from the vessel, the MT Arabian that I mentioned, right? And that it's actually a third-party vessel that is owned by the company D&T Shipping. So, essentially, what we got here is D&T Shipping having an unresolved scandal. And the year after, actually months after, because November to 2026 is small things. That's chump change. This 30,000 gallon oil spill, this scandal hasn't been resolved. And I really want to know, because I couldn't find it, who cleaning up the oil? Who is responsible for the oil? I think that is the thing that's really getting me, because we're seeing in this particular scandal, right, in this story, that there are different private, once again, y'all, Again with the private hands, again with the private interests. These private companies are pawning off the responsibility to each other. They're playing hot potato with this scandal. And the only people that's really suffering are us. And, of course, we can't forget, we'd be remiss if we forget to say that the oil spill is also making the marine life that we claim we love and need to protect and we appreciate and we owe so much of our livelihoods to, they are being damaged. Coral reefs are dying, right? We have to be more proactive as a society when we think about how we can get people to be punished, how we can get companies to actually take responsibility for their actions. Because I'm looking back and forth about it, and while they're having a back and forth, the oil's still there. That is a lot of oil, y'all. And I read that, and I read the research on that, and I don't know about y'all, but my mind went back to Dorian for some reason, because, you know, the water table was cooked from Dorian. And I need to find it, but I remember shortly after Dorian seeing a post from a lady, like just a regular Facebook post, and she was saying that, you know, the company that had like it was some sort of oil spill in Grand Bahama, that they were looking for young men to clean up the oil. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, like cleaning up oil, that's a specialized job. That requires PPE and you know, the right training. And here it was, this was being advertised on Facebook, right? And you could advertise a specialized job on Facebook, but I don't think that the goal was to get specialized people in Grand Bahama, or to even train them to have the special skill set required to clean a water table, to clean up the oil, right? So I'm concerned. It concerns me that they have another contract and they still have this scandal, and people are still trying to, you know, figure out whose fault it is at the end of the day. That concerns me. Whose fault really was it? But even so, forget the fault, man. The fault lies with you. The fault lies with both of you. Matter of fact, everybody finger on the lip. Just like we in high school, we in elementary school again. Everybody guilty, finger on the lip, right? So they're trying to pawn it off between those two companies, but they're also trying to pawn it off on the Indian manufacturer. And the Indian manufacturer, Polyhose India, has actually not participated in any of the actions thus far, right? So yeah, there's a lot going on in that. And in the judgment made by Sir Ian Winder, there was no mention of the actual details surrounding the spill. So it was just about the hose and the hose assemblies causing the spill, right? So I just want a little shout out to Neil Hartnell for following up on that, because I think in the chaos of the world, it's so easy for us to lose sight of some of the stories and some of the headlines, because this is really important, you know. I think you really have to keep bringing it up, because people will really not bring it up. They will really think, I guess that's what they think. They hope that it'll fade into black, that it'll fade into the darkness, and that we'll simply forget. And the only people who may remember are the people in Exuma who could see this oil, who experiencing it and watching, you know, their beautiful waters be damaged, right? While we in the capital, or we far away, we chilling, you know, we vibing, and we're none the wiser, because the story hasn't broke, right? We're not paying attention, or it has broken, we just let it fade away, and kind of forget about it until something even more catastrophic happens. We gotta lock in, man. But we at the point where we do a little commercial break. Thanks, Britt. So stay tuned, y'all. We're going to get into the world news in just a sec. Don't go anywhere. This is the Eye Opener, your weekly dose of something different. I'm Alea, and we're going to get into it in just a moment. Be right back. Welcome back to the Eye Opener. I'm your host, Alea, coming to you live and direct from Europe, London, where it's very cold, very wet, and there's no sun in sight. But I am very happy to be here with you and talk about some of the world news stuff. I'm all by my lonesome today, so we are traversing these world news headlines together. Tate, Dawn, and Crystal are out of the office today, so it's just me and you and all the stuff that's happening in the Caribbean. So let's start there. Before we go even wider, right? We just talked about the oil spill and the controversy about that and the contract awarded to D&T. But let's go a little bit into the contracts in CARICOM, specifically as it relates to Cuba. So a couple things have happened in these last 2 weeks. On February 27th, the Prime Minister of St. Kitts and Nevis, Dr. Terence Drew, he indicated that CARICOM's intention was to provide humanitarian support to Cuba in light of the crisis in the Spanish-speaking country. So, in response to that, I have one question, which is, where was Marco Rubio in all of this? So, for those who aren't aware, during the annual CARICOM shindig recently, we had a surprise visitor, a rat. I am so anti Marco Rubio. If you've listened to the show for the past 3 weeks, you've heard me tear into him and into Herschel Walker, our current U.S. ambassador, who is wildly unqualified. But we move on, right? The U.S. has a big thing right now for reality TV stars in politics, so I won't blame them. That's just their culture. A bit primitive, but it's what we have to deal with. That being said, Marco Rubio pulled up to CARICOM, and he said to our leaders that the Trump administration, in quotes, this is a quote from him, was giving priority to the Western Hemisphere after our region was largely being ignored for a very long time. So that's what his thing is. He said that we've been ignored for a very long time. I beg to differ. Something tells me that no, we haven't. I don't know. Maybe it's the fact that, as of late, there have been vessels in the Caribbean Sea that have been bombed. You guys have literally killed people in our own sea, in sovereign waters, mind you. You put your hands where things don't belong. You are on the ground in Trinidad and Tobago for some reason, presumably because it's so close to Venezuela, and you use the proximity there to, what, actually kidnap another world leader? Do you think this is the medieval ages? I am truly constantly flabbergasted. Guys, I think our New Year's resolution as a people needs to be, we gotta be more audacious. We gotta have more audacity. We gotta have the audacity of Marco Rubio, because you know what? That man pulls up. He pulled up to CARICOM and said, I have something to say. And what's really frying me about this whole thing is just the other day, literally just the other day, as in a few weeks ago, does anyone recall the fact that he literally stood up in front of those European world leaders and said that they need to colonize the rest of the world again? That we need to go back to the glory days? Him reminiscing about how Europe brought civilization to its knees in the global south? Is anyone recalling that here? I feel absolutely disheartened for our leaders who had to sit there while this man yapped and yapped and yapped, and none of the things he said made any sense. None of them. None of them made any sense. Maybe in his world, right, of make-believe, of being able to go to the sandbox and go to the park and steal everybody toys and then cry about it and say, Mommy, they take my toys, when they didn't come into the park with any toys to begin with. After stealing, raping, pillaging their way to nuclear supremacy and military might, you're coming into our shindig and you're bothering us. And I just don't like it. And I don't like the way, for some reason, it feels like You're trying to play nice. You can't do that. So as a world leader or any public figure or honestly anybody, when you say things sometimes they are recorded. Okay? That's the thing that people need to remember. When things are recorded, we can play them back. Okay? We're not dumb. Okay? We have technology. We know what you said 2 weeks ago, man, and you're saying something different now, and it's not adding up. And if I can be real with you, if we go and look at his track record and the track record of the United States, what he said at CARICOM is not the actual belief that he holds. It's more likely that he holds that same white supremacist Nazi rhetoric that he said in front of those world leaders in Europe. But I digress. Bahamians in or traveling to Cuba say that life on the island has actually become extremely difficult after the U.S., once again, Marco Rubio and Trump, they cut off Venezuelan oil shipments, and that triggered blackouts, transport disruptions, and rising tensions among residents, right? This was reported this week, and in that comes hand in hand with this, I guess, kind of domino effect of people halting the medical program in the Caribbean. So we have a couple countries that have actually done this, right, in our region. So Jamaica ended the 50-year-old medical program with Cuba. More than 150 Cuban doctors left Honduras yesterday after the country announced last week that it will no longer hire Cuban medical staff. And for context, right, just like us here in the Bahamas, here at home, Cubans have been in Honduras supporting the country's health system since 1998. 1998! 28 years! They were there, and they were typically posted in working class urban neighborhoods and remote rural areas. And that is a big thing for Cuba, because when they had their revolution, a lot of people couldn't read. And it was a big thing at the time for a lot of the university students, just as a little aside here, because I love that they did this. University students went into the rural areas. They went into the mountainous towns, right, in Cuba. And they taught people how to read. That was ages ago. And now Cuba has one of the highest literacy rates in the world. That is who you're ending your connection with. You're ending a connection with a people that is resilient, that has ingenuity. Like it's so confusing to me that we are doing this at the behest of the U.S., right? But those aren't the only two countries. Over the past year, Paraguay, Antigua and Barbuda, Guatemala and Guyana have all announced that they will end all medical cooperation agreements with Cuba following the intense U.S. pressure. And if we look deeper, as we have to in all things, this is actually the main source of hard currency for Cuba. And it is a source of soft power, right? It's the ability to say we're giving you a human resource, right? We're actually sending some of our best and brightest minds to you because we love you and we care about you. That is the Cuban spirit. But that is also their main source of currency. And the U.S. has decided by doing this, by pressuring us, they've decided to destroy the medical internationalism that Cuba has really been setting, the precedent that they have set. And don't forget, during COVID-19, it wasn't the U.S. that sent their doctors, right? Because they couldn't. The U.S. was so busy arguing over whether or not the virus came from China and trying to put a price on those vaccines, right? That they completely ignored the rest of the world. All I kept hearing from them was Wuhan flu and talking about Wuhan and this and that. Meanwhile, Cuba was sending doctors. Cuba was sending doctors to different countries around the world, right? When they didn't have to do so. And the U.S., as it stands, so today, right now, the U.S. has been literally revoking visas for people in countries that host Cuban medics. And the propaganda that they've been kind of just putting it on social media and all over is that it depicts the Cuban doctors as these victims of human trafficking, that they're being forced to go. And mind you, Cubans are actually being paid many more times abroad than what they earn in Cuba, right? And along with that, this is a precious resource for Cuba. But removing Cuban doctors from these Central American and West Indian nations leave giant gaps in the local and medical systems that will continue to remain unaddressed. So the U.S., mind you, will tell you, I need y'all to tell these Cuban doctors to carry their you-know-what. And in return, what do we get? Nothing. We don't get anything. When was the last time you heard that the U.S. is sending a bunch of their doctors to come live and serve in the Caribbean? In exchange for nothing, mind you. When? Absolute crickets. Because I can't think of any time that they've done that. It's not a very U.S. thing. It's not a very American political thing to give. It never has been. It probably never will be, because the empire is greedy. They're based off of military might. They're based off of sabotage, of assassination, and of theft. That is what the U.S. stood for when it was built, what the U.S. stood for during the Civil Rights era, during Reconstruction, during Jim Crow. It stands for that now. These values have never changed, right? So this real gap that a lot of our communities are facing in terms of medical assistance and care, it's gone, and it's going to be even wider without the Cuban doctors that come over to our countries to assist. So, was the CARICOM meeting really a success? Because it's not feeling like it to me. Not feeling like it to me at all, actually. And Brave, our prime minister, has actually said that the Bahamas plans to assist, right? So CARICOM pledged first to support Cuba in light of these humanitarian issues. And then the prime minister confirmed recently that the Bahamas will also be assisting in Cuba support. And I'm really curious as to know how and why, right? Specifically, what will we be doing? What will we be doing to ease the burden? Because if it was us, I can guarantee you that Cuba would do the same, that they would really go to bat for us, as they always have. Like in the case of Jamaica, right? The medical cooperation for Cuba, and with Cuba, lasted for 5 decades. So I mentioned Paraguay and Guatemala and Honduras those were places that that Cuban doctors worked there in 1998. Jamaica has had these doctors coming over for 5 decades, 50 years. And in a blink of an eye, it's gone. All because of U.S. pressure. And now they're claiming, so I read the paper today, the Jamaican Gleaner, and you can check that out online, that the decision was because both governments were unable to agree on the terms and conditions of a new technical agreement, right? The current agreement, or the previous one, was actually expired in February of 2023. Now, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Kamina Johnson, she told the Parliament on Thursday, the Jamaican Parliament, that is, that the government's decision was not influenced by the U.S. Once again, y'all, do they really think we stupid? You really gotta ask this. I feel like I've asked this about 4 times already, but that's just quite sad, isn't it? That you could just be straight up, just be straight up. Because if I can be completely transparent, in this day and age, where the United States is assisting a country in committing genocide, right, against the Palestinian people, and the bombs that they're doing this war with it on, hello, is this thing on? What? You're not fooling anybody. We know what you are about. We've seen all of this. I just feel like maybe people are scared. And it's okay to be scared. But if you're scared of the U.S. and you want to be a world leader, you want to be the Minister of Foreign Affairs, you want to be the Prime Minister of a country, you want to be the President, maybe you should stop. I would recommend maybe taking up a job as, I don't know, maybe something safe and cool, like a librarian. They're also very useful to our society. Or maybe you could come up with a hobby like knitting or crochet. Something calming, because you cannot be scared of the U.S. A place like the U.S., a country and a government like the U.S., they do not appreciate fear. They revel in it, sure, but what they really do appreciate is some vaginal fortitude. I was going to say testicular, but so many world leaders are men, things ain't looking good. So, how long? How long? My question to all of the CARICOM nations is how long? We cannot keep suffering the consequences of U.S. bloodthirst. And if I'm going to be real with y'all, the U.S. and CARICOM are in no position to lecture any of us about democracy or human rights. Because while Cuba is suffering, Haiti has been suffering. Look at what the United States has done to Haiti. Haitians are denied self-determination. Say what you want. All the bias that people may have about immigration, Haiti is a resilient country. And the reason why they are being punished to this day is because they dared to stand up. And now we have a group of people in government to this day around the world who are scared because they have seen what has been done to Haiti. And let me tell you something, that fear is not useful to us. You're not going to get anything with that. Nothing's going to change with that fear. It's palpable. You're letting the boogeyman smell your fear. And the boogeyman, just like all the monsters in the fairy tales, they feed off of that fear. Haitians have been denied self-determination in their own country because of the United States and the UK. And paramilitaries are running wild in their capital. Intervention has literally failed because the people who have ruined the country and the people who are intervening are the same groups of people. Even by their own ostensible metrics, the United States has failed. So Caribbean governments can barely manage their own countries, right? And now we are in no place to decide what another country's government should look like. And we should never as a people, just like how I said, what I said earlier about Grand Bahama, the Port Authority, there should never be a day or time in the Bahamas. This is just my opinion. You're free to disagree. But one thing about me, I love autonomy of the Bahamian people. I love the autonomy. I love the ability to have someone choose. And you're not going to scare me by being the boogeyman. You're not going to do that. Boo. You're not going to scare me. Like, it's not going to happen. So look, the U.S. is just not in a position to lecture anybody about the free market. They're not in a position to lecture us about healthcare. The U.S. destroyed Haiti's economy with subsidized American rice for people who aren't aware. And the blockade against Cuba is the most flagrant, disgusting violation of the free market. I cannot begin to describe my disgust with the idea of someone like Marco Rubio taking his piss tail behind and coming into our countries and running that fat mouth of his and saying these diabolical things and preaching to us about stuff that we already know and we want to do. You don't, the ideas that you're coming up with, Marco, I don't know if maybe somebody could relay this sentiment to him. Okay, I need him to kick rocks. I need him to scram. Matter of fact, finger on the lip. Finger on the lip, quick. Finger on the lip, everybody in a line. Marco to the back. Let's start there. So look, the oil blockade in Cuba, right? Because for also people that aren't aware, the Venezuelan production of oil was Cuba's largest source of oil. That was where Cuba got its oil, right? There was that connection and that commerce there. And the oil blockade in Cuba has actually caused rolling blackouts, and it's left many Cubanos to be without electricity. Hospitals have not been able to support the needs of the patients, and still, Cuba says, let me send my doctors. Seriously. Like, it pains me, bro, because this is a country that has had so much happen and still rises to the occasion, still with the lung cancer vaccine. You know what it is for a country to have a lung cancer vaccine? No, you don't, because we're not a part of the country that has a lung cancer vaccine. Cuba is. So, look, I just want a shameless plug here. This is important to me. If you, like myself, are very passionate about helping Cubans, you're very passionate about being your brother's keeper, and you're very passionate about just community building, But most of all, you are passionate about making sure the United States does not harm another one of our countries. You can donate to help secure generators for Cuba at letcubalive.info. That's letcubalive.info. You can go on there and get some resources and donate if you have any of the heart or the mind or the financial means to do so. I would genuinely so appreciate that. But the Cuban people are resilient, right? Like, this is just a fact. So I was looking it up because I wanted to, y'all know how I go. I like to check a little bit, do a little background, little background vibes. I say, let me go type in my Googles. And The Economist actually posted an article at the end of February about the oil embargo, right? And what was so interesting to me was the oil embargo actually revealed a solar boom in Cuba. And that, I feel, speaks volumes. That the immediate thing that they did, they immediately looked for solutions. And now they're having a solar boom and people are using solar power. But still, it's not enough. That oil blockade is really doing it. So now we're coming to the present time. So one of Friday's headlines was about the negotiations over Cuban healthcare workers as well. Now, Cubans are us. We have to remember that. And we are not exempt from the vassal state action of what they want us to do, right? The U.S. wants the Caribbean to act as proxy. And it always wants us to act in proxy for their own nefarious gain, right? The Minister of Health, our Minister of Health now. So we're coming back to the shores, back to the local. And we're seeing how this pans out. So let's go into it. So our Minister of Health, last week, Michael Darville, he said that yesterday the government is moving to secure more medical staff for our public system, but that negotiations between the Bahamas and the U.S. over Cuban healthcare workers were going well. And that is what frying me. So if you didn't catch that just now, Cuba ain't nowhere to be found in that discussion. So once these negotiations end, however, he said that our government will shift to direct contractual agreements with Cuban healthcare workers already in the country. And that is all well and good, But now you have a West Indian Minister of Health admitting on record that we don't have the full agency over our own agreements with another government. We need to stop. As a region, we have to stop. We have to stop depriving our own people of good things just for the sake of U.S. imperialist ambitions, bro. Thomas Sankara literally said that you cannot be giving me don't give me grain. If you want to help me, give me the equipment. Give me the tools to make the grain, to sow the earth, to deal with that, to do agriculture, to have a robust healthcare system. Don't come to me with the finished product. And that's a fact. The U.S. isn't giving us anything in return. What are they giving us? Not being bombed? They're doing that already in our own sea, in our own waters, as we speak. And then what they're doing is, as the drones are attacking, as they're striking these vessels, these boats, which could have anyone on them. It could be you, me, your aunt, your uncle, your grandparents. It could be anyone. And what they say after they do the drone strike, what they say after they bomb the boats? Oh, that was just a drug trafficker. Those were gangs. Absolutely wrong. Absolutely disgusting and absolutely illegal. But when I think of international law, and when you think of international law, right? What do we think of? Because personally for me, I realize international law doesn't actually mean a thing. It doesn't mean anything. We're not actually getting to see any result from that. No one's penalized, let alone the United States or Europe. So, it feels like the only real Negroes up in here are the Dominicans. So, Prime Minister Skerrit of Dominica assured the country this week that they are actually going to keep their Cuban specialists. The hospital's main ICU depends on them. And he specifically said, this is a quote again from him, "We want to appreciate the impact of the Cuban medical doctors and nurses." And that means everything to me. That means everything to me. Solidarity means everything to me. We're so strong in numbers, and I think people forget, because we are such a small country, right? The Bahamas is so small. Because we are tiny, we forget the value of us geopolitically, and of us as a people. We just simply forget, and we forget that we are stronger in numbers. And so that solidarity is power. That's bargaining power. That's market power. That's political power. That's a voting bloc, right? We are the back door of the United States. We have so much power. We have more power than we think, and more power than we know. And even as individuals, right? In this capitalist system, we have more power than we know. So, today, let's get to the news today. So, President Trump threatened to overthrow the communist government in Cuba. Yes. He actually said the words today. He said that he wanted to wait a couple weeks after military interventions were done in Venezuela and Iran. So what had happened was there was a little courtesy call between him and the Cuban-American owner of a soccer club this weekend on Friday, the Cuban-American guy. And they were having a little photo op and, the little shaky of the hands. And then he just says, this is a quote from Donald Trump, "I just want to wait a couple of weeks. But we'll be together again soon, I suspect, celebrating what's going on in Cuba. They want to make a deal so badly, you have no idea." End quote. I have so many ideas. One of them being that they do not, in fact, want to make a deal so badly. They literally do not care about you. Actually, they don't care if you live or die, man, and neither do I, if I could be real with you. I am so good off that. I would really appreciate it. I don't know what it's going to take to get the United States to understand that it really needs to mind its own business and stop sabotaging countries in the global south. In a further interview with CNN, also on Friday, Trump said Cuba's gonna fall pretty soon. That's a quote from him, and he said that he was going to, in quote, this is once again, my enemy is coming up, y'all, get ready for this quote. He's going to put Marco Rubio over there. We've got plenty of time, but Cuba's ready, end quote. Marco Rubio, once again at the scene of the crime. Marco, that rat. Oh my goodness. So the U.S. has previously attempted regime change in Cuba, most infamously during the Bay of Pigs invasion, right? This was when anti-communist exiles, supported by the CIA. So another word for that is gusano, right? A lot of the white, wealthy slave owners, literally plantation owners in Cuba before the revolution, during Cuba having an actual dictator before Fidel Castro, those anti-communist exiles, were supported by the CIA, and they attempted to land on the island in 1961, and they were confronted by revolutionaries and lost. Humiliating defeat, to be specific, crushing defeat. And that is outside the alleged 600 or so unsuccessful assassination attempts on Fidel Castro's life. How bored could you be? Mind you, this is during the civil rights era. This is what continuously, absolutely kills me about the United States. So much could be going on. Something really pressing could be going on in its own shores. We are dealing with ICE in the United States, right? The fact that this was during the Civil War, where Black people were, and African Americans, right, and Latinos, people of color, were really completely and utterly disenfranchised, and were fighting for the right to be seen and heard, as they should be. They will focus on Cuba. They said, nah, we're good. What about Cuba, though? So look, recent times, let's get back to the present. Trinidad and Tobago, specifically the Prime Minister, Kamala Persad-Bissessar, she called a state of emergency this week in the country, and she also said this week that she's not ruling out a further United States military presence in the country following her summit with Trump today, actually. So they will be meeting, and hopefully by next week we will be getting an update on that and finding out how that goes. But I'm just going to go out and say it. She's a traitor. The Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Kamala, is a traitor by putting the desires of a pedophilic imperial regime, of the pedophilic empire, over the safety of Trinidad and Tobago and the entire West Indies. She knows She knows. So this is what I'm saying. It's almost as if our leaders think we are stupid sometimes when they say things. I don't know if it's out of fear. I don't know what it is. But she's not dumb. Okay? The Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago is not dumb. She knows that by having military bases on our islands makes them legitimate targets during war. She's not stupid. If we take a look at what's going on in Iran right now, Iran is not striking countries, They're not doing that. Iran is taking a deliberate attack, a deliberate strike against U.S. military bases in the countries, in the region, right? In its nearby, in those neighboring states. And it is a target. It is. But even further, there is no reason for America to have a base in the Bahamas. There is no reason for them to have a base in Cuba. There's no reason for them to have a base in Trinidad and Tobago. This is our land. And I'm tired of having to say that you are encroaching on it. It's ridiculous. Like, how many times do we have to have this conversation with you, old man? Get off my lawn. So, all of that being said, it also came out this week that the United States and Venezuela decided to resume diplomatic ties. Now, mind you, this actually comes after they wrongfully and illegally kidnapped the president of Venezuela and his wife. The president of Venezuela and his wife. That is what they're saying is consequence. And so I understand the fear, but you cannot have fear because it's honestly if I do, if I don't situation. If you do, you end up being a vassal state. You get walked over. And in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, you get that military base, you're still a target. You may not be a target for now, but you will be a target. And when the going gets tough and you reach out to the United States for help, they won't help you. They're not going to come and save you. They don't care. They already got what they wanted from you. So, for decades, Cuba relied on that cheap oil import from Venezuela to prop up its economy, but these have dried up since Trump ordered the special forces in the United States to actually abduct Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela. And they installed Delcy Rodriguez, the former vice president, as his successor. And I just want to say this was always the plan. This was always the plan. I want to get into the Iran-US-Israel war, what's going on, what it means, how it's occurring, and whose side we should really be on. I find that a lot of us tend to overestimate how safe we are, right? Safety is a frame of mind. Safety is a frame of mind. We have to stay aware and we have to keep abreast of what's going on outside of our world because there is a huge world outside of us and outside of our sphere of influence, and there's so much going on, and we can be affected, and we are being affected because we use gas in our cars, right? We use diesel, we use gas. So why I start with Venezuela, you will see this is literally the plan, and it only hit so many people so recently when we figured out what was going on with Iran, right? Okay, where do we start? How Iran became Iran? How did this happen? Where did this political stance come from? So, Iran pursued a nuclear program since at least 1957, right? They had various degrees of success. It was during a war with Iraq that they decided to develop nuclear weapons, and this was in the 1980s. So I'm going to just give you a little brief outline of where they came from and how they are now, right? So after the 1980s, they pursued an agreement with China and Russia to support the program's research throughout the 1990s. And then in 2002, the National Council of Resistance in Iran, which is an umbrella organization made of dissident groups, revolutionary groups, they actually exposed the existence of 2 nuclear sites that were hidden. Then the next year, in 2003, diplomats internationally launched an effort to halt their nuclear program. And Iran was like, fine, but we will keep the centrifuges for nuclear energy, right? But they didn't follow through on the commitment to actually report transparency, which is understandable because the United States and Europe are not transparent about stuff. We know this all the time, right? So, June 2004, September 2005, They are deemed non-compliant with the nuclear stuff that's going on. And then this brings us to the United Nations Security Council, right? In 2006, the UN adopted a resolution 1696, if anybody wants to look that up, which is the first legally binding call for Iran to actually suspend its uranium enrichment program so that they don't have nuclear development, right? Now, after that, they just boom, boom, boom. It just keeps going. They just keep adopting more resolutions to impose crippling economic sanctions on Iran for their failure to suspend the actual activities of uranium enrichment. So that's 2004, 2005, whatever. Now let's go to 2011 and 2015. So after the sanctions, all of these sanctions, of course, are going to have an effect. Iran is now having to deal with that. Their economy contracts by 20% and unemployment rises to 20%. And we talk a lot, but we, meaning the United States, talks a lot about Iran's suppression of women's rights, right? Wrong. 70% of university graduates in Iran are women in STEM. Because of the economy and the unemployment for women is 50. And that's where we get into the gender disparity. So I wanted to be clear about what that is, about what the gender discrepancy is and how that works, because that's important to me to be transparent on that as well, because that is an issue. So I'm not praising Iran for that. I just want to be clear that that is a real thing, a real issue, right? So the Ayatollah who recently was assassinated, he was the only thing standing in the way between Iran and building a nuclear power. So the U.S.-Israeli missiles, now let's go to the present time. They've made him a martyr. The U.S.-Israeli missiles have hit 4 schools in 6 days since the war began. They've hit 2 girls' schools, and over 180 was killed in just one of them, right? It was an Afro-Iranian area. So there are black people just like you and me, right? A diverse country. And they were killed. Those children were murdered. Meanwhile, Iran is actually striking bases, but the U.S. and Israel are striking children. So that tells you where the priorities lie. So where does that bring us? Where does that bring the Bahamas? I say all of that to say this. What's happening in Gaza, it proves international law will not protect you. What's happening in Iran proves that international law will not protect you. International law is a tool, is a gavel for the United States and Europe to bang on our heads when we don't act in the way that they want us to. All of humanity for the first time has been watching Palestine. All eyes are on Palestine as Israel and the United States literally bombed them and tried to commit genocide on such a resilient people. And if I can be once again transparent, I think the Iranians are brave and heroic for actually fighting against Zionism, for fighting against genocide. And as we know now with the Epstein files, fighting against the pedophile U.S. empire. It's a colonizer state who is backed by Israel. And conforming to that, as our leaders so many times tend to do so, it doesn't protect us. So why do I bring up Gaza? Why do I bring up Venezuela? Why do I bring up Iran? Because today, me, tomorrow, you. So on Saturday, 28th of February, right, the war criminals Trump and Netanyahu, they led an unprovoked murderous attack on Iran. They killed the head of state, and they also bombed children. They bombed the schools. Essentially, the Strait nearby, which is where 20%, I believe, of the world's oil actually comes from. It's massive. So domestically, Donald Trump is under so much pressure with the publication of the Epstein files, and he's also having lots of pushback in Minneapolis with ICE, right, with the war on migrants and the war on people living there. And then there's also divisions within MAGA, within the Republican Party. So he's trying to deliver on promises, and also promising to end America's forever wars. That's going up in smoke with all this stuff in Iran. And for the first time, there is so much opposition to being in the United States, as people in the United States against military intervention in Iran. There's only 20% of people supporting it, right? So look, let's get down to how this affects us. So this has resulted in considerable economic dislocation around the world. So Dubai Airport, for example, they have been shut down. And then the oil and gas traders have suspended shipments through the Strait of Hormuz, which is where 20% of the world's oil and gas passes through, right? Just as I said a few moments ago. And the Wall Street Journal reported today that America is actually bracing for an oil shock because prices this week skyrocketed at their fastest pace on record. I live in the UK, y'all, so I was like, let me see how this is affecting the girlies over here. And gas prices in the United Kingdom, right here in London where I'm at, it was up 72% over the past week. That's a lot. That is a lot. So the Iranians have so much right. They have every right to oppose the regime of the United States and Israel, which massacred thousands of ordinary people who took to the streets in the last 2 months. And the only person, it seems, or the only major world leader to actually decry this is Spain's Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, who actually criticized them and said, he actually said this on television. He said that escalating the conflict in West Asia was akin to playing Russian roulette. And he said, these are his words, we're not going to be complicit in something that's bad for the world and is also contrary to our values and interests, just out of fear of reprisal from someone. I thought that was so powerful. I thought that was incredibly powerful. We have to ask ourselves, what we really want out of this. What do we really want? The United States was playing chess. So I mentioned Venezuela and how that actually comes into play with Iran. Venezuela is a major producer of oil. They closed up the strait. The United States is resuming diplomatic ties with Venezuela, presumably to get that oil, because they can't get oil from anywhere else right now with the strait being closed. And we are nearby. And Trinidad and Tobago is talking about military bases on the island. So we got to ask ourselves, we got to really look in the mirror as a people, as a region. We got to ask ourselves, when the U.S. makes it clear that it intentionally harms the entire population of Cuba, of Iran, of Venezuela, can you expect the same United States to be aligned with the best interests of the people in Cuba and in Venezuela and in Iran, let alone the people of the Bahamas, let alone the people of Jamaica, like you and I, of Honduras, of Paraguay, all those countries that they pressured to stop Cuban doctors from assisting and helping our medical and boosting our medical industry? We literally have to speak seriously about it, West Indian alignment. Let's even take it home. Bahamian alignment with the U.S. against Cuba out of concern for the Cuban people. Is that what it is? Because I don't think so. It's not. Or are we just throwing Cuba under the bus once again in hopes that they will take their eyes off of us and they won't target us in the future the way they target Cuba and they have targeted Haiti and they continue to target Haiti? These are mutually exclusive, by the way. That's the thing. Sanctions are designed to ensure that the government cannot provide basic public services that people expect from it. And once you do that, the government then becomes moot. And once the government becomes moot, then they can sweep in and say, hey, we have all the things you need. We are the saviors of the day. And that's when they can finally get the regime change that they want. It's about crippling our lives normally. It's about making the Cuban people's lives miserable. That is what the United States is doing. That is what they're hoping for. So, in these last couple moments of the show, I'm feeling, me personally, mind you, it's just me and you here, but in these last few moments, I'm feeling a bit somber. But I also feel hopeful. I always try to feel hopeful because the spread of knowledge is how we mobilize. The spread of knowledge is how, that's power. That's real power. Real power lies with you. Real power lies with us. Real power lies in the knowledge, wisdom, and the understanding of the world around us and our own society. James Baldwin says that the only way we can actually begin to analyze our society is by being educated. Once you're educated, that's when you begin to analyze the society with which you operate in and the framework which you operate in. Iran, for example, we're new to this, right? We're relatively, and by relatively, I mean we're a very new nation. But Iran is one of the most ancient civilizations in the world. That is an ancient culture of art, of cinema, of poetry, spirituality, of diversity, right? And language. And to see a country like that, just like how Haiti stood, just like how Bolivia once stood and Cuba is standing and continues to stand, hopefully, to see it standing alone, right? It's wounded, but it's still fighting. And it's fighting against one of the most powerful genocidal empires of our time is hopeful. That gives me hope because we're witnessing history. So what everyone needs to start doing, along with accruing that knowledge, if you haven't started reading up on, the geopolitics of everything, because everything is connected, we are all connected, is questioning everything. We have to question the society that we are in, question our leaders, question what they're doing when they give out those contracts. Like when we talked about that D&T shipping before the break, that's precisely it. When we talk about the military bases and what that might mean, when we talk about immigration and even the rhetoric of immigration, right? When people talk about Haitians negatively, we have to analyze, where is this rhetoric coming from? Who is benefiting when you talk badly about Haitians? Who is benefiting when you disparage immigrants in the Bahamas? And then dig deeper. Not only who is benefiting, but how am I losing out? What do I lose as a people? What do I gain? North Korea, for example, right? This is completely out of left field, but North Korea, for example, is a country that is only the way it is because of the United States, if you didn't know, right? The United States hated that the Koreans were not budging. They weren't acting the way they wanted them to act. And they bombed Korea. And that created this separation. It triggered a ton of events to where we are now. And when I think about the propaganda of North Korea, for example, and the propaganda about Cuba, Fidel Castro being a dictator, right? Maduro being a dictator, they use language to corrupt our minds and to change the way we see each other. And we have ingested so much propaganda about Cuba, about Iran, about Bolivia, about North Korea and Venezuela, and we have internalized that propaganda. And then we speak on it as though we have all of the information, we have all the pieces of the puzzle. We don't. The pieces of the puzzle that we have, they've been manufactured for us by people in a lab, in an American lab. And we're just regurgitating the points that they want us to say. So what about Kim Jong-un makes him a crazy dictator? What about Maduro makes him a dictator? Like, we have to really analyze this stuff. We hear so much about other nations, but for some reason we don't see that these labels, and we don't use these labels for the President of the United States. And we never have, even though people were bombed. More bombings were done under President Obama than Trump, if I remember correctly, if I'm speaking correctly. And we don't call him a dictator. We still call him a charismatic leader and a charismatic president, and people still love him and sing his praises. But that is just what it is, right? That is language. So when I think about all of this, and I think about the rationale behind, like, the blockade against Gaza, and I think about the kidnapping of Maduro, the president of Venezuela, and I think about how they have taken over the oil and how they're doing the sanctions against Cuba, and then the previous sanctions that we just talked about in that history lesson about Iran, they are all connected. And the goal has never been to free any of us. The goal has